unique opportunity to have a lecture by Professor Arnold Körte about this building, what he knows well, and especially therefore that he has written a book about architect Martin Gropiuse, the author of this building, the architect of this building. And the book was published in 2013, and it is in several libraries in Estonia, an art academy, and there is on the table also, so that you can browse it there and you can order it also. But Professor Körte is born in 1934 in Rome. He had studied architecture in one of the most well-known German technological universities in Munich. Thereafter he continued in Harvard in US in late 50s and early 60s, worked there at the well-known the Architects Collaborative Office, what was led by the Martin Gropiuse, who had who has emigrated from Europe to America already in 1937 and has built there in Harvard extensively and was then very important office in US. Then you had a certain career in Canada, where you worked at the Manitoba State University in Winnipeg until in 1973 Professor Körte returned to Europe and worked in Hochschule für Gestaltung in Offenbach, and thereafter 20 years from 1980 to 2000 as a professor in the Technical University of Darmstadt. For Estonian audience, a very well-known school because one of our most important Estonian architects, Herbert Johansson, also has studied there. And he's not the only one of Estonians who have studied there. Although Professor Körte's architectural oeuvre is mainly located outside of Europe, but he has also been very active historian. He has several publications on the 19th century. Mainly, first of all, the bridges of what were so important new topic, the metal bridges for the architecture of 19th century. But recently he has also published a book, Die Begegnungen mit Walter Gropius, the meetings with Walter Gropius, published in 2018. And this book is also available here. You can buy it if you would like. And this is interesting in this sense that with this book, but through your personal memoirs, you also have addressed 20th century. But this Martin Gropiuse book about your grandmother's father is really a comprehensive book. There is several pages about this building as well. But as you say there, it's mainly based on the brochure what was written in the early 90s by Estonian architecture historian Karin Hallas. She was then very young, and she has later been very critical that, oh, I didn't know then this and that, and I guess that maybe she would like to have a new version of her booklet. Anyway, we are convinced that this building deserves really thorough research. But with this introduction, I am happy to give the floor to Professor Körte to put the author of this building to a wide context, because for us in Tallinn it's really great that here in a anyway, in the 19th century, certainly small provincial town, we have such a building by a great Berlin architecture. Please, Professor Körte, the floor is yours. Oh, you don't need it.
Yeah. Yes. Do I need this microphone? No. Okay. Okay. Yes. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation to speak here in Tallinn. It is a bit curious to come here because I have never been to Tallinn before, but it feels a little bit like a homecoming to see this work by my great-grandfather. So it must be the special spirit of Martin Gropiuse evoking this feeling of being at home. I'm sorry, I have a cold. I hope you can hear me. Okay, I sit down. Now, the palace, the former palace of Count Ewald von Ungern-Sternberg, in the context of other works by Martin Gropiuse. I think it's quite important to see this building in the context and in the backdrop of his other works, because this building is really quite different from most of his other works, and it's really outstanding in the artistic perfection which went into this edifice. Now, Martin Gropiuse and Count Ewald von Ungern-Sternberg met for the first time between 1850 and 1855, when the latter just studied philosophy at Berlin University, and the former studied architecture at the Berliner Bauakademie, Academy of Building. There, Gropiuse was under the guidance of the best architects of the day in the wake of the school of Carl Friedrich Schinkel. Gropiuse today is considered to be the best architect coming out of the so-called younger Schinkel school, whatever that means. Whether or not Count Ewald already asked Gropiuse at this time, when there were students in Berlin, to design his palace in Reval, we don't know. But it must have been a meeting of the minds right from the outset. Both of these students were of the same age. They were both born in 1824. Possibly, the commission was given to Gropiuse a bit later, when he had already designed some private houses in Berlin, and most notably, the today so-called Martin Gropiuse Hospital in Eberswalde. Eberswalde is a small provincial town north of Berlin. This hospital in Eberswalde was originally designed as an Irrenanstalt. That's in English, a lunatic asylum, an asylum for the mentally ill. So for Gropiuse, he was only 36 years old. At this time, this was a great challenge, and he deeply immersed himself in the intricalities of such a lunatic asylum. In those days, there was a change going on from the so-called restraint policy to a more lenient treatment of the mentally ill in order to not apply force, but to let the people recover by more peaceful means. So it was quite a change in the history of hospital design. And Gropiuse, interestingly enough, he had no experience whatsoever in the design of hospitals. It is believed today that he got this commission through the connections to the medical profession in Berlin at the time. Also, the Landgraf, one of the people involved, was a relative of his mother. So there are some internal relationships. You see the two people? They are no longer students here. They are now grown up in middle age. Gropiuse is 52 years old, and Count Ewald perhaps 40. I don't know when the picture was taken. But they were born in the same year, 1824. So now Eberswalde. This was a very rational floor plan conducted in the old corridor system. So all the departments in this large hospital are interconnected by corridors. This is called the block system. This hospital in Eberswalde was built in 1862 to 65, shortly before this building was done. It was still following the so-called block system, with all departments collected under one roof. So you could walk from one end of the other to the other unprotected, and you didn't have to go outside. This was important for the treatment of the people. The even more modern pavilion system had only just come up, was then realized in the hospital in Friedrichshain, which is in Berlin. This was the official city hospital of Berlin, built shortly after. For this hospital, he entered a partnership with Heino Schmieden. Schmieden was 11 years younger than Gropiuse, but he was a very talented architect in his own right. For a long time, Schmieden was not even mentioned as a significant architect in the works of Gropiuse. But most of the later works were all done in close collaboration with Heino Schmieden. So here we see very clearly the pavilion system. So for each disease, they built a separate pavilion. Pavilion meaning, in this case, is sort of an elongated kind of structure, which was more or less autark in the sense that they had their own necessities within the building. The idea was that each disease, malaria, diphtheria, whatever, should be treated separately in separate buildings. This was, Now, Gropiuse had declared with some self-confidence that mental illness is not a contagious disease. So even though most hospitals were built in the pavilion system, his was still built in the old, outdated block system. Now, to Gropiuse, it was important to relieve the monotony that tends to go with large modern hospitals. So he articulated this mass of buildings into smaller units with the corner turrets at the edge, and to give it a kind of a residential feeling. The observers at the time, when this was new, today it's grown in the woods, it's in a wooded area, but there it was totally bare. So the people called this a little Schlösschen, which means a small castle, because it had this kind of home-like, intimate atmosphere. So it's quite unlike the other hospital types, which look more factory-like, more standard type. So this was unusual and quite new for the time to build it in such a way in separate units. By breaking down the large mass into smaller units, by inserting bay windows, bay windows like an erker, bay windows along the corridors, by using flat-arched window bands. In German, this is Segmentbogenfenster. This is slightly rounded windows, which are placed side by side in series. So this makes for a continuous, fluid atmosphere of the window bands. I'll show you later. Also by using yellow face brick, not unlike perhaps your building here in Tallinn, it created an almost residential atmosphere, well suited for the treatment of the mentally ill. I have already mentioned the no restraint policy. This originated in England, which means not to use straitjackets for mentally ill and other coercing measures. No straitjackets and so on. The goal was to enter into a personal relationship with these mentally ill people. In a wider sense, this Eberswalde project is indeed a kind of forerunner to your Estonian Academy, even though it was built in Eberswalde in a very reduced manner. There was not much money available. It was built at low cost with very sparse ornamentation or embellishment. So in that sense, there is no comparison to your building here, but in the basic concept, there are many similarities. So the entry already anticipates some elements of the Estonian Academy with the triple Roman arches on the ground floor, the segmentbogen arches at the upper floors, in the articulation of window units as a unit, 3 together, and in the use of natural brick. No stucco, no embellishment, just the natural yellow brick with horizontal red brick to give some kind of scale to the building. So by the human eye would sort of follow up the scaling effect of these horizontal red strips, and therefore gets a feeling of the scale, the size of this building. In a way, it is also an attempt to humanize this rather sort of factory-like impression of a modern hospital. So subsequently, Gropiuse developed a personal neoclassicist style, all its own, which he followed up with dedication until his early death in 1880, at the age of only 56. Also Martin Gropiuse died relatively young. At the end of his career, he had Parkinson, as his right hand was trembling, and it was quite a blow, of course, to the architectural scene in Berlin, not to speak about his family, to lose Martin at the age of only 56. In this relatively short period, he managed to build about 120 buildings, whereby the Friedrichshain is counted as a single building. Actually, each building, again, is an architectural effort of sorts. So it's, in actual fact, he has done many more than 120 buildings in his short life. My point is that your academy building in Tallinn can only be understood within the context of his other works elsewhere. Built in 1865, it appears in fact as the mirror image of his artistic development so far. I'm talking about this building. It signifies the artistic stage of development he had reached by 65. Yet, in contrast, your building here displays some additional features or explorations, artistic explorations, which go far beyond the stage of refinement achieved in Friedrichshain. So perhaps for better understanding, let's first examine the roots of that so-called Schinkel school. Art historians usually call it the Schinkel school, which is the neoclassicistic stream of international architecture. The so-called Schinkel school was based on the so-called tectonics of the Greeks. Tectonics of the Greeks was the title of a very important book at that time, written by Karl Bötticher. Karl Bötticher was a theoretician and art historian in Berlin at the Bauakademie at that time. His book on tectonics, as he called it, as die Tektonik der Hellenen, he called it, tectonics of the Greeks, left quite an impact at the time because it was so unusual to have a total theory developed out of this tectonic style. It left quite an impact at the time, but it was no easy reading. As this book, two volumes of this tectonics of the Greeks, was not easy reading. In fact, some people tried to avoid reading these two big books. Actually, Bötticher has been the drawing teacher of Martin Gropiuse when he was only 80 years old. So Bötticher and Gropiuse had a rather close relationship, while Schinkel was more the house guest of his parents. The parents were also well known in Berlin society. They were doctors and architects and stage designers. There was a whole family involved in this artistic scene. So the most direct influence was exerted by Karl Bötticher. He was quite a formidable figure, while Schinkel was more the occasional house guest of his parents. Now, what is the theory of tectonics? The theory is based on the clear expression of Kraftfluss. Kraftfluss, the German word Kraftfluss, means flow of force. The flow of force was supposed to be visible even by laymen from the outside. So instead of guessing around for some time, the theory was that this Kraftfluss, flow of force, had to be recognized immediately, just like in a Greek temple. So the Greek temple was, so to speak, the ideal of this neoclassicist style. This can be shown quite, yeah. This is the entrance porticus to the house which Martin Gropiuse built for himself. This was a rented, larger 4-story building, but this is the entrance to this house. It is very easily understood by anybody as the typical symbiosis of a Greek temple in that time, at that time. So it has all the well-known elements, the Corinthian capitals, the fluted columns, the architrave on top, and the triangular gable above. This was the basic language of the tectonic style. Now you see the transformation of this tectonic style into almost modern times. This is in fact the house of Dr. Karl Eggers. He was his neighbor, next to Gropius' own house in the street am Karlsbad in Berlin. This is quite an amazing design at the time because it precedes modern architecture. It's a very clear expression of the flow of force, of the load-bearing elements, of the transverse elements, and most particularly the ratio, the almost extreme ratio of void and solid planes. So the size of the windows is remarkably large for the time when you compare this to other buildings by other architects at that time, in about the mid-60s. So in terms of ornamentation, it's interesting that according to the tectonics, the ornamentation had to be strictly limited to certain areas, like the horizontal frieze was allowed to be ornamented. The vertical columns were also ornamented, but in a very disciplined manner, in a very small area. Also, the attica on top is typical for Gropius. These small windows, usually they were, the attica was used for the drying of laundry. So this was a functional concession. But in the total, it is probably a real prototypical example of this tectonic style. The statue of Pallas Athene down at the main floor is a full-size sculpture sitting in a niche. This was, of course, quite a statement at the time. Dr. Karl Eggers used that sculpture also as a kind of trademark for his scholarship. He was a connoisseur of arts. He wrote several books on classical antiquity, and he wanted to show to the public his affinity to the Greek culture. Now, this style in Berlin was clearly structured, but it was also austere. It was not flamboyant. It was less flamboyant than your Academy building, because in Berlin, Gropius felt obliged to his acknowledgement as a pure classicist. Whenever Gropius went away from Berlin to other places, he was more open, he was more free, he was more explorative, in Tallinn especially so. In English, this is not called neoclassicism, but it's called Palladianism, or Palladian style, according to, derived from Andrea Palladio. I think, though, this connection to Andrea Palladio is a bit remote. It's a popular saying in English, in the English cultural context, to call this Palladian style. Well, be this as it may, in Berlin it's neoclassicism. In Northern Europe, in Scandinavia, in Prussia, the neoclassic stream excelled in a especially noble and finely tuned manner. By contrast, the neo-Renaissance was foreign, originally was quite foreign to this Prussian spirit. The neo-Renaissance had originated in Paris around 1850, so a bit before the time we are talking about. But this neo-Renaissance of the Parisian version soon spread all among the rest of Europe, especially Southern Europe, to Vienna, Austria, etc., because it was very attractive, because the neo-Renaissance style is much more rich, is richer, it's more flamboyant, it's more colorful, it's more explorative. It's not so strictly following the rules like the neoclassicists. Now, we should also remember a political context, which is usually overlooked. The political context in France. Because after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, France had to pay horrendous contributions to Prussia in the defeat in this war. So these contributions or retributions, they caused an enormous building boom in Germany. So suddenly there was big commissions by government, also by private people. There were speculation in Berlin. Berlin was expanding rapidly, but it's often overlooked that these millions of French money had enabled the impetus to this building boom. In fact, the firm of Gropiuse and Schmieden benefited substantially from this unexpected boom of money available for public and private buildings. So it led to a long line of, a long succession of splendid commissions for the firm of Gropiuse and Schmieden, but there were several others which were equally successful. So curiously, a popular sentiment was that what France had lost in a military sense, it had now gained or compensated in a cultural sense, because the Parisian neo-Renaissance suddenly spread around Berlin and the northern countries. So this Prussian neoclassic style was the trademark of this period. Now, applying to Gropius himself, he does not, the neo-Renaissance did not really interest Gropius himself as a person. He was too much embedded in the Schinkel school. So this clear tectonic orders was for him predominant, while the Renaissance architecture tended to obscure the clear tectonic order by ornamentation, much richer ornamentation, much more variation in the execution. So When we now look a bit closer at the architectural language of Gropius, we might best start off with his country houses. This is the book I wrote, the big book. This is not a country house, this is of course the city house of Bleichroeder. Mr. Bleichroeder was one of the richest bankers in Berlin at that time. This is, was demolished by speculation. Okay, so here we have the first of these so-called country houses. Most of these examples were situated east of the Oder River in what is today Poland. Almost all of them were destroyed by Russian artillery fire during the last month of World War II. But these lesser-known examples, most built for his relatives, are important in that they point to a kind of split personality in Gropius' work. While he strictly followed neoclassical principles in Berlin, where his reputation was based, he took more stylistic liberties or the license whenever he went abroad. Now this is still, of course, quite within the tectonic style of Berlin. In my book on his work, I'm sorry, this is okay. The next, I'm sorry, I'll go back, yeah. Now this is, the name of this is Tuchow. Tuchow was a small colonial town in what is today's Poland, built in 1864. It was, as you can see, a massive and somewhat gloomy-looking edifice, gloomy-looking from the outside, forbidding, massive, solid. But despite of this austere exterior, it had a very large interior hall. You see it on the plan. And this interior hall was skylit from above. And this central court was the place where the life of the family took place. It was the social focus of the whole family. The people at that time had many children, and in this case they had 12 children. So this was quite a lively place in the center where it says the Saal, the large central room. So it shows the particular lifestyle of the Prussian nobility, holding an outpost of civilization, as they said, in the eastern wilderness. The master studio in the upstairs corner room was even called the Vatican, now down there at the corner, the Vatican. The second example of these country houses is Rosenfelde of 1872. It was a rather more modest but elegant two-story mansion with bay windows again. These bay windows on the side, they break the long facade and make for a residential feeling. Rather more elegant but modest two-story mansion. It had a bay window and a covered terrace, large terrace, sitting there in calm and peaceful horizontality along the lakeside, typical for the lifestyle of this Russian nobility in today's Poland. Then the third example is Tief Hartmannsdorf. Tief Hartmannsdorf, built in 1874 near the Czech border, all the way south in Silesia, all the way to the southern border, close to Czechoslovakia. This, of course, is quite different. This is neo-Baroque. No more Renaissance, no more Classicism, neo-Baroque. It is believed today that his partner, Heino Schmieden, was the responsible architect for this, because Schmieden was a very versatile architect, not so ordered and structured as Martin Gropiuse. Schmieden, in his youth, had been to France. He visited the castles at the Loire, the famous French castles in the Loire Valley. He sketched them, he did beautiful sketches, and he was very familiar with this style. So this just to show you the spread in the work at those examples which were not located in Berlin. And finally, Grasset. This is again much more Gropius, but this is no coincidence, because here in 1880 we see actually a Baroque mansion in the side wings, but this mansion had partially burned in a fire. So Gropius in the middle inserted a truly Hellenic style porticus. So it's really two different languages brought together in this single building. Of course, the triangles above the windows and the side wings, they are not Baroque anymore. So it's a mixture of styles. But again, Martin had a wonderful talent to create a kind of peaceful harmony between vertical windows, horizontal bands, frieze, and the gable, triangular gable, cutting through the roof line. So this was important to create this kind of image. Now, back to Berlin. Regarding the architect's role generally in society of mid-19th century, we must realize that a good architect of the day was supposed to be able to work in any conceivable style. So churches had to be neo-Gothic. Public buildings like schools or town halls were to be neo-Romanesque. Residences for the upper class were to be neo-Renaissance. Private inner city houses were even Swiss cottage style. So Swiss cottage style is a kind of timber frame structure. Just to explain the variation of styles, and the modern architect of the day had to be able to encompass all these styles within his own ability. So this willful use of styles, this easy hopping from one to another, culminated in a popular saying in English: the structure must be modern and the style will be angeputzt, will be applied onto. This is really a strange situation. It means that the style has nothing to do anymore with the inner structure or the layout of the building, but the style is like an exterior coat which will be angeputzt, will be applied to by plaster, by the stucco man, by stucco. This way, of course, the style loses its inner meaning or its inner origin. This mixture, forget for a moment the two pictures here. This mixture of styles, of course, is one of the reasons that for a long time the art and architecture of the 19th century has been looked upon with contempt or even disgust. I remember well, my parents, they were both art historians. They only spoke with mild disgust about art of the 19th century. So the 19th century was a topic better not to be mentioned. A no-no, as the English say. So, admittedly, Gropiuse himself was not shy of utilizing elements from other styles in his late work. But he did this in a most selective and considerate manner, never prone to cheap showmanship or to betraying his classicist principles. However, in a self-reflecting letter of 1868, written to his wife, he writes with some regret, I quote, "With the Hellenic style today, you could not lure a dog away from his oven." But honestly, his prime impetus was not to imitate the Greek style, the classic Greek architecture, but to rejuvenate it, to rejuvenate architecture of today in the spirit of antiquity. Now this is quite a spread of goals, all combined in this one sentence. To rejuvenate architecture in the spirit of antiquity. For today's artistic needs. So finally, we now see two examples. And we see also the development from the modest scale of Schinkel at the top. This is a two-story bank building, Berliner Kassenverein, People's Kassa, Bank, People's Bank. It's interesting to see again the center motif of the Greek temple and the gable clearly cutting through the roof line. So from a distance, it still has a bit the ambience of a Greek temple. Now, down at the bottom picture, this is the big building of the Berliner Handelsgesellschaft, trade society, you would say in English. Berliner Trade Society or Trade Company. Here you see a big change because that Greek temple motif is simply glued on to the facade, like an element you might as well take away. Okay? It has no influence anymore at the total building. The total building is, in fact, a most modern office building, 4 stories high, and with many windows going on left and right. So what I want to show with that is that the Schinkel School buildings, in their very scale, don't lend themselves to modern architecture. But Gropiuse thought that he could, in fact, rejuvenate modern architecture in the Greek style. Today we see this with some mixed emotions, perhaps. But it is interesting that within a few years, the sheer scale of buildings had increased so much, also with all that money coming in from the war retributions, resulted in an enormous building boom. Okay, now with that, let us look at Tallinn in some detail. You will recognize many similar elements, like the Roman arches, triple arches at the bottom, then the segment arches, the flat arches on the upper windows. But what is really new and most unusual for Gropius' work is the dormer windows in the roof area. So this entire roof area, you might call this neo-Renaissance. I don't know what is the really appropriate definition for that, but it is really casting off everything else Gropius did before. I like to point to the oculi, the circular little windows, and of course to the dormer windows, which are almost done like separate buildings set on top of the structure. And most noticeable, of course, the chimneys. No other building of Gropius has chimneys like that. Chimneys with a perforated top, chimney head on top. So this is a mark, a sign of distinction. I believe that Gropius used it deliberately in order to emphasize the nobility and the special rank of this building. So the entry side on the courtyard side shows all the familiar elements we have seen so far, even down to the articulated balustrade, elaborated dormer windows, and so on, but in a new way and much more elaborated and much more flamboyant, more almost exuberant expression. Now we come to a drawing, a really excellent drawing by Gropius of an earlier stage of this building, seen from the Pigyalk side. And when you look very close, you can tell a tectonic grid of columns and architraves put across the building behind. It's a very finely detailed, very ordered, like a grid, a secondary grid in front of the basic building. So none of this was actually executed. I'm not an expert on the facade of this building, but it seems to me that Gropius, at a later date, decided, or maybe Count Ewald decided to build this in limestone. And this yellow limestone with large blocks did not lend itself to such a fine texture of tectonic style. So all this grid, I can call it a tectonic grid, was abolished, and we now have the pure tectonics. But no more columns, no more cannelures, no more Corinthian capitals, etc., etc. Okay, so it's in a way it's a reduction going back to the tectonics, except for the roof portion. The roof, of course, is definitely neo-Renaissance. If this used term neo-Renaissance really means anything, I think with the multitude of neo-Renaissance buildings done all over Europe in the 19th century, this term neo-Renaissance doesn't make too much sense. At least it's not specific enough. Okay, so this is how it was meant to be by Gropius, but maybe it was decided by Count Ewald to simplify the facade because of the use of limestone, and limestone comes in larger blocks, and they do not lend themselves to this fine detail. To me, it looks like Gropius wanted the building perhaps to be plastered, in plaster, and have the columns and the risalites set into the soft plaster. Maybe the risalites and the columns were meant to be in marble, could be, set into the plaster, like a relief structure. But this is just my own speculation. So, as we have seen, most of the buildings in Berlin have excelled in a calculated understatement in line with Prussian frugality. No doubt the new inventions in Tallinn contribute to the stately and festive character of the exterior. There's one further thing. The yellowish limestone, void of any plastering, adds an aura of honesty or Materialgerechtigkeit. In German, this long word Materialgerechtigkeit means appropriateness of materials. So the material, according to Bauhaus, etc. doctrine, the material itself is already the form-giving element, okay? Not the ornamentation. So Materialgerechtigkeit, appropriateness of materials, had become a kind of catchphrase of the Bauhaus. So Walter Gropius again and again emphasized the so-called material appropriateness of material, which means each material should be used according to its own nature or to its own character. Okay. We could also say Gropius in Tallinn is walking a thin line, as the English say. He is walking a thin line, meaning he is at very dangerous territory. He is trying to mix neo-Renaissance with neoclassicist principles. So the building is really a mixture, but a highly interesting and innovative mixture of styles. Now, the interior, of course, is well known to you, so I can do this quickly, just to go through this marvelous interior. There is the lunettes above the doorways, then there's the cornice where the wall meets the ceiling. This is an important architectural element which we have totally lost today in our modern rooms. We live in rooms which have a wall and a ceiling, and there's nothing where the two meet. It's just an empty groove. So this is a big loss we have in modern architecture. Of course, Walter Gropius, he was not very nice when he spoke about 19th century. And he was very skeptical about the value of this kind of ornamentation for modern needs. But this is how it was. Then the lunettes, very fanciful, very artistic, very inventive in their execution. I was told today that there is identical example in Riga, in an other building. But unfortunately, we don't know who was the original artist. The question would be, where did these artists or artisans come from? Did they come from Southern Europe? Did they come from France, from Italy, from Spain, Austria maybe? Or did they come from Riga? Or did they come from Scandinavia? it's hard to say. So I think there is a field for more research in the future on the real origin of these wonderful lunettes. Yeah. Now, this is interesting. Gropius was also called a master of color. On the left, you see the color composition in the house of Mr. Haché in Dresden. This is the way Gropius used to combine colors by mixing warm colors, red, with cold colors, blue, okay? So it's a very daring composition, a mixture of warm colors with cold colors. It creates an oscillation for the viewer, and and he tried this kind of composition many times in little color samples. So this is the way he worked in his studio, and he tried ever new combinations of colors. Of course, this habit is not Gropius unique. Other architects at the time also worked in a similar way. Okay, it was just it's just really amazing when we look at today's architectural practice, how little attention we give to colors and to the combination of colors. Again, we have lost a lot of artistic expression by our absence of colors. And on the right, this is the former room of Countess Adele, the wife of Ewald. And it shows again this contrast between the red wall and the bluish cornice up above. To me, it looks a bit bold, perhaps overly bold. Perhaps the colors have been redone at some date, I don't know. Maybe there was some renovation going on in this building, some around 1900 perhaps. But this again is maybe room for some further research. Okay. Now, yeah, okay. To conclude, let's go to the Martin Gropius Bau, as it's called today in Berlin. The Martin Gropius Bau is the best known example of the work of Gropius. The building was completed in 1881 after his death, and its history is quite troublesome. In World War II, the northwestern corner at the right was destroyed, was hit by a bomb, and the interior was largely burned out, so only the empty shell was remaining. For decades, the building stood in ruins like this. So for many decades, so the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, we had this kind of impression. There were little birch trees growing on top. Now, the building stands next to the former Berlin Wall. So after the Berlin Wall was dismantled, the Berlin Senate of Berlin planned on putting a highway right through the site of this building. Luckily, it didn't happen. And now comes the story of one single woman. Her name is Maria Gensmer. Maria Gensmer is a distant relative of Martin Gropiuse, descendant of Martin Gropiuse, and she is the one who led Walter Gropiuse to the ruin, and she showed to him the present state of dilapidation. So it was really Maria Gensmer who saved the building from demolishing. Then in turn, Walter approached the Berlin Senate and spoke up for the heritage of his granduncle, second line. So, as I said, Walter Gropiuse was not speaking very nicely about the work of Martin, because Walter had a deep suspicion against the value of Baugeschichte, history of building. So Walter, in his whole furor of Bauhaus propaganda, had a negative attitude towards any history of architecture. Okay, so now this is Walter Gropiuse in his late period when I worked for him in Boston. So I studied in Munich, and I had already finished my studies. One day I decided I want to go to study more, to enter school again at Walter Gropiuse. But Walter at that time had already left Harvard University. He was now head of the Architects Collaborative. The Architects Collaborative, abbreviated TAC, T-A-C, was one of the most successful architectural firms in the United States. So we did many school buildings, campus buildings all over the world in the 1960s. So back to Martin Gropiuse. What is so unusual, what is so significant about this building? Well, just look at the repetition of the Hellenic motif, the gable motif. Each and every window again repeats that gable motif, that neoclassicistic gable motif. This is most unusual. There is no other building in the world which repeats the central section so many times, and it goes all around the building. All four facades are decorated in this multitude of a Greek temple motif. This is almost like Andy Warhol with his soup cans, repeating and repeating and repeating. So it's an attitude treating neoclassicism as something, as a tool of parts, as a kit of parts, which you could use at will. So my theory is that Martin at that time, in the year of his death, 1880, had internally already left the true principles of classicism. Well, it's my thought. Okay, just to conclude, next year, in 2024, we have the 200th anniversary of the birth of Martin Gropiuse. For this anniversary, we plan an exhibition, and we plan to show not just the well-known buildings once again, but to show the workmen at their work. So there is a photographer in Berlin. His name is Karl Ludwig Lange, and this Lange made it a point to photograph the workmen while they did this extensive renovation job. So all the different trades, part of the trades are not existing anymore. All these traits can be seen in the work by these. So up here, this man is just opposite from the lion's head up there on top. And as we can see here in Tallinn, the lion's head is a very cherished motif by Gropius. At the left, it's Gropius Bau in Berlin. In the middle, it's Metapont, classical antiquity, antique. At the right, I didn't know until today where this lion's head exists in your building here. But I've been told it's out at the wood, at the lower section of the entry door. So there can be seen a small lion's head. Anyway, the lion's head is an important mark of distinction to the work of Gropius. Okay, now here we see those people doing in our modern 21st century to manipulate these large blocks in marble. They were done by sculptors and stonemasons in our modern day, and here they put them into place by manual labor. They could not use cranes because this was too delicate, so they used manual labor. We are still trying to find out the names of these workmen. We would really very much like to know who were they as individuals. They must have had a name, they had a trade, they were skilled in their profession. But in Germany today, we have a silly discussion going on about Datenschutz, which means protection of personal data. So we are not allowed to quote the names of individuals for some silly reasons. But maybe we still have 1 year's time, so till September 24 of the year 2024, we hope to find out the names. So here they are, and this is what I like to close this talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Körte, for this fantastic introduction to oeuvre of Martin Gropiuse. It was a really well-chosen selection of his works, and it was fantastic to hear your professional analysis of our building here. Probably the audience have questions to you. I open the floor to you. You are... Yeah, please. There will come just a moment. The mic arrives.
Thank you very much. That's a great pleasure to listen to you. I have a question if actually our respectful author is serious about classical forms. I suspect he has a lot of humor about classical forms. What do you think? How much humor is he's using like classical forms, but is he combining, playing with it basically? So my question is there humor in his... Humor, jokes about these classical forms at the end?
Well, one can sense a sense of humor. Yes, I agree. It is generally speaking, Martin Gropiuse was a very humorous person himself. He was in his family. He had a schooled voice. He could sing. He was a schooled, a trained singer. So he had 7 daughters, and with his 7 daughters, he did house concert, home concerts for the public. So they were playing different roles, and the daughters, and one played the piano, and the other, and he sang songs, and so he had a very strong sense of family. Family togetherness was important to him. So, yeah, so there is a humorous element also in his architecture, perhaps.
Thank you. More questions, please? For me, most interesting was your analysis of this building. How do you explain that the wall material changed to the limestone?
Yeah.
But if we look at this French roofscape, the dormers are still of yellow brick. How does these things go together?
Well, maybe there's an element of humor also in here. It's against the rules. It's against the rules. Because when you have limestone, you of course, as an architect, you would try to stick truthfully to this beautiful natural material, limestone. And then suddenly, up there, he makes brick, yellow brick or red brick, whatever. And also for the roofing itself, they used sheet metal and not slate.
Originally it was slate.
Slate?
Yeah.
Oh, it was slate, okay.
Yeah.
It was slate, yeah. So at a later date, it must have been redone, maybe after the war, I don't know. Was there war damage here? Or?
Not really,
No.
but it was probably already earlier, because there has been already so many metal roofs.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Oh, yeah. Well, it's surprising to see metal roof up there.
Okay.
It's surprising.
Yeah, but the slate in Estonia is so extraordinary.
Yeah.
A couple of, probably Oliver, you know how many slate roofs we have at all. Most the manor, very few ones. It's very extraordinary for Estonia. Very expensive, always imported.
Yeah. You don't have a quarry for slate?
No. Not
So
at all.
where does the slate come from?
Oliver, you are a better specialist in 19th century than me. What's the origin of our slate?
We don't have actually resources about it, but most probably it was from Germany, from Netherlands, where they imported it. So it was always here a very, let's say, kind of exotic material.
Exotic.
Yeah, giving a certain, Western European character also to the building, because it was not a local material, and there's maybe even a kind of interesting tension between the local material, very traditional local material, limestone, and this slate roof that brings in such elegant, aristocratic Western European character.
This is interesting because in Germany we have slate quarries. We have natural slate in the Rhine Valley, and the slate originally was even used for normal houses, because in those days, near the quarry, the slate was a cheap material, so it was easy to get. So in some places in the Rhineland, slate is actually poor man's housing. And later, it became a status symbol whenever it was used in those areas where there is no natural slate to be found. So this is a strange transition in the perception of the value of natural material, from poor man's roofing to rich man's palace.
It just shows how different are the contexts. We don't have slate, but we do have limestone. Do you think that this, on its original drawing, you said that it probably was plastered, but this ornamentation, you don't think that it could have made of terracotta, these ornamentations there?
Yeah, it's also possible in terracotta, one could have done, but you would have to apply the terracotta to the limestone.
Yeah.
And that's a bit funny, isn't it? I mean, that's a bit strange. So,
But we have plenty, all Tallinn houses are built, old ones are built of limestone and they are plastered.
yes,
So also
that's the natural way to do it.
Yeah, and to stuck there, also terracotta is not a problem. But do you think that Martin Gropiuse was aware at all about this change of material?
Oh, yeah. He had a very deep relationship to the material. In his studio at home, he had samples of brick, various burns of brick, and he had a sample of wood, all kinds of wooden samples. He also he had a good way to deal with workmen. In his time, it was not normal for an architect to speak to a workman as a person-to-person dialogue. But you had this Prussian man on top, and he said how you are supposed to do. So he had a great natural respect for the craftsmanship and the ability of the normal workman. And it was also his students, also the way he dealt with his students was much admired because he never showed the authoritarian man who knows everything, but he really had a great ability to listen patiently to what the students would ask or what they would say before he said how to do it. So this kind of humility. Yeah.
Good to hear. Are there more questions? If not, then lots of thanks for this very rich presentation, what opened a lot of our eyes on Martin Gropiuse, and lots of thanks.
You're welcome.
And I hope you forgive me if I now continue with the audience my explanations about the building, what you know so well in Estonians.
Yes.
Nii, et aitäh, te saate istuda, you may sit back. ma lähen siis edasi eesti keeles natuke selle majaga. Põnevamad osad on mõnes mõttes juba ära olnud ja ära räägitud, aga ma mõtlesin, et paasena juurde siis nendest Ungern-Sternbergi kui Hiiumaalt Suuremõisa mõisnikke ja see, kes siis nii-öelda tegeles selle rannarööviga, oli selle maja ehitanud Eevaldi vanaisa. Et see mõisate hulk, mis Ungern-Sternbergidele toona kuulus, oli väga muljetavaldav. Ka Kärdla Kalevivabrik oli Eevaldi isa ja onu asutatud ja nad olid peamised osanikud seal. Ja see Adele, keda mainiti, oli siis sünnilt von Stackelberg, mis tähendas seda, et ka tema tõi ja mitu mõisa perre juurde. Ja väidetavalt siis, nagu me teame, Toompeal aadli elulaadi oli siis see, et pool aastat maal oma mõisas, mis siis selle perekonna jaoks tähendas peamiselt Suuremõisat või Elistveret, mida me nüüd loomapargina teame. Ja talve siis Toompeal. Nüüd majast pärast Stackelberg ja kui Eevald ära suri, siis ütleme, et tuleb siin kausalt nüüd üles tunnistada, ma tahtsin laiemas kontekstis jõuda, et see maja oli ikkagi omas ajas väga maja, see, et niisugune linnapalee veel ehitati, ta oli viimane Toompea suur linnapalee, sest nende aeg oli tegelikult üle. ja siis perekond ei jõudnud niisugust elulaad ja stiil kõikidel juba muutus 20. sajandi tulles, et siin ei suudetud enam Toompeal niimoodi elada. See niisugune aadlikultuur oli asendumas kodanliku kultuuriga. Ja seetõttu 90 aastate lõpus siis maja perekond müüb maja ära, see käib siin ütelkonnast ja käib käest ette, kuni seal on mitu vahetust ja kuni lõpuks siis Eesti kirjanduse selts, Estnische Literarische Gesellschaft, avab siis 1911 siin provintsiaalmuseumi, mis on siis nii-öelda sakslaste vaatenurgast Liivimaa või siis Eestimaa ja Liivimaa ajaloomuuseum. Siin on kõik ka ekspositsioonid, kus huvitav on vaadata, et näiteks selles ekspositsioonis August Veitsenbergi kujud kuuluvad orgaaniliselt selle Balti-Saksa ajaloo hulka. Ja 20. aastatel muutub see maja siis niisuguseks tõrjutud seisundis Balti-sakslaste omavalitsus tuleb siia ja nagu nende kultuurilised institutsioonid, nii et ta jääb selliseks nagu saksluse Mustpeade maja kõrval selline saksluse tähtis kants aina eestistuvas Tallinnas, mis loomulikult nüüd sakslaste südant ei soojendanud. Kuni siis nõukogude ajal provintsiaalmuuseumi kogud lähevad ajaloo- ja revolutsioonimuuseumisse, revolutsiooni asi on sealt nüüd ära kadunud, eks ole, üsna uttu kadus ära, et ta oli siis Eesti riiklik ajaloomuuseum, see, mis nüüd on jõudnud Maarjamäele ja ütleme, nende provintsiaalmuuseumi need huvitavamad arheoloogilised, ka mitmete suguvõsade vappide, raudrüüde ja kõik see kollektsioon on siis, osalt fondid on Maarjamäel, aga Suurgildi hoones on ka osa asju, eks ole, väljas. Ja peagi visati nad ka siis provintsiaalmuuseumist, siis revolutsiooni ajaloomuuseum välja ja anti see Eesti Teaduste Akadeemiale, mis oli asutatud 1938. aastal Tartus ja muideks seal seina peal te näete silti Tartust laial tänavalt, mis siis oli selle algse 38 asutatud Teaduste Akadeemia maja peal. Aga Teaduste Akadeemia oli nõukogude ajal täiesti teist tüüpi asutus kui praegu, ta oli sisuliselt teadusministeerium. See tähendab seda, et see olid nagu esindusruumid ja siin olid president ja aga see Teaduste Akadeemia president kamandas, ma nüüd isegi ei mäleta peast rääkides, mitut teadusliku uurimise instituuti, aga neid oli tohutult palju. Ja alles 90-ndatel siis nende Laari-aegsete radikaalsete reformidega liideti kõik need uurimisinstituudid ülikoolidega, et teadus ja õpe paremini omavahel siduda. Ja Teaduste Akadeemiale jäi alles ainult üks uurimisasutus, milleks on siis praeguse nimega Under Tuglase kirjanduskeskus, sellepärast, et Friedrich Tuglas oli pärandanud oma maja ja selle sisu, mis sisaldab nii Underi kui Tuglase kunstikogu ja raamatukogu Teaduste Akadeemiale ja seda ei olnud võimalik kellelegi laiali jaotada. Nii et see jäi paratamatult Teaduste Akadeemiale. Ja Teaduste Akadeemia ise on siis tänapäeval personaalakadeemia ja tegelikult me nüüd oleme jõudu mööda, et seda maja paremini kasutada, võtnud siia keele ja kirjanduse endise instituudi, teine nimetus, ja need Under Tuglase teadlased on siin, et me kasutame neid ruume mõistlikult ära kasutada, sest personaalakadeemiane nii suurt maja tegelikult Teaduste Akadeemia ei vaja. Nii palju maja hilisemast saatusest, aga lähme nüüd tagasi selle maja tekkeloo juurde. Ma mainiks, Toompea oli selle kaupmeeste alllinna suhtes aadli linn, ülalinn, siin on järjest tulevad võimsad aadlipaleed ja nendes aadlipaleede seas on siis Ungern-Sternbergide oma viimane. 1860. aastad, Tallinn tegelikult sel ajal väga ei õitse, raudtee tuleb Tallinnasse alles 1870, mis annab niisuguse arengutõuke, et tegelikult on tegemist niisuguse unise kubermangu linnana, kus selline Berliinist tellitud projektiga maja on ikka pretsedenditu uhkeldamine. Et see oli ikka niuke, et kõike oli vaja üle trumbata. Nüüd see oli väga huvitav, kuidas professor Körte rääkis, sest seda nüüd Hallase brošüüris ei ole, aga Hallas tegelikult selle sama asjani nüüd selles eelviimasena ilmunud Eesti kunstiajaloo Köite lühikeses lõigus jõuab, et see neoklassitsism ja neorenessants, see, kuidas see sajandi keskpaigas, või ütleme, see on ju see saksa kultuuri igivana probleem, see alaväärsuskompleks prantsuse kultuuri ees. Ja nüüd 19. sajandi keskel on siis igal pool Euroopas tohutu prantsuse neorenessantsi laine. Ameerika Ühendriigid, neid niukse mansard katusega maju, selliseid prantsuse päraseid kerkib sajandi keskel üle maailma. See on niuke ülemaailmne suur moelaine. Nüüd tõepoolest, siis selle konkreetse maja puhul ei ole nüüd ainult see mansardkatusega katusemaastik, see, mis on selgelt selline prantsuse pärane, vaid ka see paigutus krundil. See on, kui te tulite ja lähensite, tulite eesõue ja teil olid kahel pool need tallid. See on tüüpiline Pariisi hotell particulier. Nii nagu neid alates 17. sajandist Pariisis lõputult kerkib, et see niisugune prantsuspärasus on veel mitmel pool sees. Ja veel, et kui niisugustes klassikalises, selles neoklassitsismis oleks kindlasti vaja olnud tsentraalset, keskset trepikoda, siis Gropiuse, kui me ringi liigume, kuigi ma ei tea, palju me ringi suudame nii arvuka, kena näha, et teid nii palju on, nii arvuka seltskonnaga siin majas suudame, kuigi me peame tunnistama, et ma olen üldse praegu vaimustuses sellest tänasest olukorrast, kui ma siia tulin, et peaaegu esimest korda on kõikide ruumide uksed lahti, et nii avarana on väga harva olnud võimalik seda maja tajuda. Et kui te sealt uksest tulite sisse, siis te tulite kohe siia suurde saali. Ei olnud keskset trepikoda. Ja täpselt nii nagu Pariisis nendel hotel particuliedes on siis trepikoda on tõstetud keskteljelt kõrvale. Siis nüüd veel selle maja, nagu professor Körte väga hästi analüüsis, see, kuidas need dekoreeritud fassaad asendati selle paega, aga et see baas mõjub erakordselt efektselt ka sellel põhjusel, et meil on tegemist täiesti erandliku paigutusega linnaruumis, ta on järsaku serval. Ehk siis see, et kui te vaatate linnast siia üles, te näete selgelt 3-korruselist maja. Ja kui te tulite Kohtu tänavalt sisse, te nägite 2-korruselist maja, eks ole. Et siin meie all on tegelikult veel suur täiskorrus. Ja see järsaku serval olek on siin ma nõustun kindlalt Karin Hallasega, et see on nagu hästi huvitav mõte, et see baas nagu kandub edasi. Et see jäi praegu, tal ei ole ka piisavalt, eks ole, detailseid, ütleme, arhiivi andmeid, see on ainult oletused, et miks ikkagi see fassaad läks paeseks. Ja ma ei saanud, sest ta viimasest minu küsimusest sai teistmoodi aru, ma ei tahtnud enam vana inimest kiusata, et tegelikult, kui te mõtlete selle pae kasutamisele, jah, 19. sajandi pae kasutus on just täpselt see materiaalstiil, et ta on puhas materjal välja toodud, aga kui te vaatate varasema Tallinna ajaloo peale, siis neid ornamente oleks ju saanud paest lõigata ka. Mõelge see sama Tallinna suur vapp Paksu Margareta kõrval värava peal, et kui kihvt, kui oleks kõik see, mida Joonis nägi ette, mis Gropiuse oli ette näinud, kui selle kõik olekski paest välja lõiganud. Aga 19. sajandil keegi niimoodi baasi enam ei voolinud või ei lõigatud või see kunst oli nagu 19. sajandiks ära kadunud. Nii, nüüd me jõudsime nende ühtede joontega majja sisse, aga siis selline üldine ruumide dispositsioon. Loomulikult on tegemist siis kõigepealt foyer, vestibül, ja sealt kohe on võimalik tulla siia suurde peasaali. Peasaali taga, kus praegu on presidendi kabinet, see punaste seintega, me saame sinna kõik minna ka, see on siis nii-öelda buduaar, prouatuba. Te tunnete selle ära sealt, selle laes on palju niisugusem mahlasem, vallatum, värvilisem, neorokokoolik lausa dekoor. Ja siis siinpool on projektist suuremad erinevused. Et kui ühel pool on proua pool, siis see on härra pool. Aga nüüd see nurk on projekti peal üks tuba suur, mis ehkki meil projekti peal ei ole kirjas ruumide otstarbet, aga see on loogiline, ta on niisugune piklik 3 aknaga ja peasaaliga otseühenduses, see on loogiline, et see on söögisaal projekti peal. Aga nagu ta siit juba vaikselt paistab, seal on sein vahel, ta on jaotatud, need 3 aknaga ruum on jaotatud 2 aknaga suurem ruum ja kitsam ruum. Ja ta on saanud seina peale paneeleeringu. Ja see paneeleering osutab see paneeleering ikkagi ka või väga selgelt osutada söögitoale. Need söögitoad, nii kummaline, aga see ei ole meil tänapäeval nagu see mõte, et söök peab olema alati hästi välja valgustatud, sa näed, mida sa sööd, sa saad ainult siis õige naudingu kätte, aga vanades mõisates ka sageli on söögituba kõige tumedam, sageli sellise tumeda laepaneeleeringuga. Nii. Et see on see peakorruse üldine ruumidispositsioon. Pärast me läheme korraks ka üles, aga ma räägin enne mikrofoni või ära, et üleval on 2-poolne koridorsüsteem magamistubadele, mis on suhteliselt vahvavetne ja mitte eriti mugav, aga ütleme, mis ma ei tohi nii öelda, mina on ise 20. sajandi arhitektuuri ajaloolane, lihtsalt siis olid ruumide analüüsnaga ruumi, see, mida mugavaks peeti, oli edasi arenenud. Et niisugune 2-poolne koridorsüsteem oli 20. sajandil peeti seda koledaks, 19. sajandil oli see väga moodne alles. Ja mis on põnev ja mis on üldse Gropiusele omane ja 19. sajandi niisugusele innovaatilisusele, mida me siin ka nendest illustratsioonidest nägime, et see keskne koridor või siin oli ühes villas oli trepihall, sellelt läheb üles valgusšaht ja katuseaknad annavad ilma akendeta maja keskel olevale ruumile läbi pööningu valguse. See on ju hästi 19. sajandi võte, mida Eestis hiljem väga harva on. Olev Siinma kasutas oma villal vannitoa valgustamiseks seda võtet. Aga muidu ta kaob nagu pärast ära, sest õpitakse ruume teistmoodi ka kombineerima. Aga veel, teie küsisite selle huumori kohta. Kui te vaatate neid lünette, siis täpselt samasugused lünetid on Riia Polütehnikumi hoonel, mis praegu on Läti ülikool, ja selle väikses saalis, mis on Gustav Hilbingi projekteeritud 1800 umbes samal ajal, ma täpselt seegi ei tea, umbes samal ajal. Ja nüüd, mina ei ole seda maja nii-öelda teaduslikult uurinud ja ei Hilbingit ega Riiat ka, aga see on nagu Karin Hallaselt teada saadud. Ja nüüd Karin Hallas ka räägib nendest lünettidest. Aga kui ma mõtlen ja olen alati vaadanud nende lünettide peale, no näete, seal on see sama Rooma kotkas keskel ja seal on kiri Senatus Populus Quae Romanum. Siis siin on atlas, mis kannab maailmat, siin on lihtsalt tuli ja nende ees on veel ka mitmesuguseid, seal on see Gaius Mucius Scaevola, no tegelikult võib-olla kui nüüd kohutavalt süveneks, siis selle loo, selle jutustuse narratiivi saaks ka kokku panna, aga mulle on ta alati tundunud suhteliselt juhuslik ja äkki selles võib ka siis leida mingit humoristlikku nüanssi. Aga nüüd olete nii kaua istunud, et tõuskem siis püsti ja liiguks nendes ruumides natuke. I offer them a chance to